The flames danced against the darkening sky as angry voices echoed through Dustbrook's dusty streets. "Burn the witch!" they screamed, their torches casting demonic shadows on weathered faces. But between the mob and the terrified girl stood one man, a weathered rancher whose calloused hands had never trembled until this moment. What he didn't know was that his act of courage would summon an army unlike anything the Wild West had ever seen. This is the story of how protecting one innocent soul awakened a force that would shake the very foundations of a lawless town. Hold on to your hats, because this tale of frontier justice will leave you speechless. Make sure to like and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens when 100 women on horseback ride into town at dawn. The scorching August sun beat down mercilessly on Dustbrook, a ramshackle frontier town clinging to existence in the harsh Nevada territory of 1884. Dust devils danced between the crooked wooden buildings that lined the main street, where the local saloon's bat-wing doors creaked in the stifling breeze. The air was thick with the smell of horse sweat, leather, and the ever-present dust that seemed to coat everything in this godforsaken place. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his supply wagon down the rutted main street. At 52, he was a man carved by the frontier, broad shoulders bent from years of hard labor, hands scarred by barbed wire and branded by countless hours under the relentless sun. His gray eyes had seen too much violence, too much injustice, but they still held a spark of decency that set him apart from most men in these parts. The town seemed unusually agitated this morning. Small clusters of people whispered urgently on wooden sidewalks, their faces animated with a mixture of fear and excitement that McKenna recognized all too well. In frontier towns like Dustbrook, rumors spread faster than wildfire, and they were often just as destructive. "McKenna," called out Pete Morrison, the blacksmith, his massive frame blocking the morning sun. "You hear about the Wilson girl?" Thomas reined in his horses, noting the way Morrison's eyes glittered with malicious glee. "What about her?" "Preacher Caldwell says she's been consorting with the devil himself, caught her gathering herbs by moonlight, muttering strange words. The milk's been souring all over town, and Mrs. Henderson's baby took sick right after the girl looked at him." McKenna's jaw tightened. He'd known Sarah Wilson since she was a child, a quiet, intelligent girl of 16 who had been caring for her ailing grandmother alone since her parents died of fever 2 winters ago. The idea of that gentle soul practicing witchcraft was absurd, but he knew how quickly fear could transform a community into a mob. "That's foolish talk, Morrison. The girl's doing nothing but trying to keep her grandmother alive with what herbs she can find." Morrison's face darkened. "Preacher says different. Says the signs are clear as day. Town's calling a meeting tonight to decide what to do about her." A cold dread settled in McKenna's stomach. He'd seen these meetings before in other towns. They rarely ended with just talk. As the day wore on, the whispers grew louder, more venomous. Preacher Caldwell, a gaunt man with eyes like black coals, moved through the town like a spider spinning his web of fear and superstition. He spoke of biblical retribution, of cleansing the community of evil, his voice carrying the hypnotic cadence that had made him powerful in a town hungry for someone to blame for their hardships. McKenna knew Caldwell's type, men who used religion as a weapon, who found power in other people's fear. He'd seen the preacher's wandering eyes follow young women, had heard whispers about his private counseling sessions with vulnerable girls. Sarah Wilson, with no family to protect her, would make a perfect target for a man like Caldwell. As evening approached, McKenna found himself riding toward the Wilson cabin on the outskirts of town. The small dwelling sat in a grove of cottonwood trees, its garden patch testament to Sarah's desperate attempts to coax medicine from the unforgiving soil. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and he could see the girl's silhouette moving inside, tending to her bedridden grandmother. He knocked gently on the weathered door. When Sarah opened it, her face was pale with worry, her dark eyes reflecting a fear that no 16-year-old should have to carry. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard. People are saying terrible things about me." Looking at her, this slip of a girl in her patched dress, her hands stained with herb gathering, her face gaunt from too many meals skipped to feed her grandmother, McKenna felt something harden in his chest. She was just a child trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to crush anyone who was different, anyone who was vulnerable. "Sarah," he said gently, "pack what you can carry. You and your grandmother are coming to my ranch tonight." Her eyes widened. "But sir, I can't leave. They're planning something, child, and I won't stand by and watch it happen." From inside the cabin came a weak voice. "Sarah? Who's there?" The girl's grandmother, Mary Wilson, had been the town's unofficial healer for 30 years before age, and illness had confined her to bed. She was a woman who had delivered half the babies in Dustbrook, who had sat beside sickbeds and eased the passing of the dying. If anyone in this town understood the difference between healing herbs and witchcraft, it was Mary Wilson. "It's Thomas McKenna, Mary," he called out. "I'm here to help." As night fell over Dustbrook, McKenna's wagon rolled through the darkness toward his ranch, carrying 2 frightened women toward what he hoped would be safety. Behind them, the lights of the town flickered like angry eyes, and somewhere in that maze of wooden buildings, Preacher Caldwell was whipping the community into a frenzy that would demand blood before dawn. McKenna didn't know it yet, but his simple act of decency had already set in motion events that would transform not just his life, but the entire territory. The woman beside him, young Sarah Wilson, carried more than just her grandmother's herbal knowledge. She carried a secret that connected her to a network of women who had been watching, waiting, and preparing for exactly this kind of moment. The Wild West was about to discover that some forces were more powerful than fear, more enduring than hatred, and more dangerous than any mob. As the wagon wheels turned through the desert night, carrying its precious cargo toward an uncertain dawn, neither McKenna nor Sarah could imagine the army that was already mobilizing in response to the injustice brewing in Dustbrook. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about power, justice, and the true strength that dwells in the hearts of the oppressed. Dawn broke over McKenna's ranch with deceptive tranquility. The weathered rancher stood on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. His modest spread, a sturdy log house, a well-built barn, and corrals that had housed cattle through countless seasons, had always been his sanctuary from the chaos of frontier life. Today it would become a fortress. Inside the house, Sarah tended to her grandmother, who had slept fitfully through the night, her breathing labored but steady. The girl moved with quiet efficiency, preparing willowbark tea for the old woman's pain while trying to mask her own terror. Through the window she could see dust clouds rising from the direction of town, riders, and lots of them. McKenna had seen the dust too. He counted at least 20 horses, maybe more, kicking up a cloud that spoke of urgent purpose. His weathered hands tightened around his rifle as he stepped down from the porch, positioning himself between the approaching riders and his house. The mob arrived like a force of nature, angry men on lathered horses, their faces twisted with righteous fury and bloodlust. At their head rode Preacher Caldwell, his black coat flapping like raven's wings, his gaunt face alight with fanatic fervor. Behind him came the town's most influential citizens, Mayor Hutchins, fat and sweating despite the morning cool, Sheriff Bronson, a weak man who had long ago sold his badge to whoever held the most power, and a dozen others whose grievances against life had found focus in the persecution of a helpless girl. "McKenna," Caldwell's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "We know you're harboring the witch. Hand her over, and you won't be considered complicit in her evil." Thomas McKenna stood his ground, his rifle held ready but not yet raised. At 6'2", with shoulders broadened by decades of ranch work, he cut an imposing figure even against 20 armed men. His gray eyes held steady as they swept across the faces of men he'd known for years, men he'd helped during hard winters, men whose cattle he'd rounded up when they strayed, men who had once called him friend. "Sarah Wilson is under my protection," McKenna said, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty yard. "She's done nothing wrong but try to keep her grandmother alive." Mayor Hutchins, his jowls quivering with indignation, leaned forward in his saddle. "Thomas, be reasonable. The signs are clear. Milk souring, babies falling sick, crops failing. The girl's been seen gathering herbs at midnight, muttering incantations. Preacher Caldwell has identified her as a servant of Satan himself." "I've identified her correctly," Caldwell interjected, his black eyes burning with zealous fire. "The Lord has revealed her true nature to me in visions. She must be cleansed by fire, as the scriptures command. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." McKenna's jaw tightened. He'd read the good book cover to cover during long winter nights, and he knew how men like Caldwell twisted its words to serve their own dark purposes. Funny how your visions always seem to target the most vulnerable among us, preacher. Young girls with no family to protect them, old women with property you covet, anyone who might threaten your hold on this town. A murmur ran through the crowd of riders. Some faces showed uncertainty. McKenna's words had hit their mark, but Caldwell's voice rose above the whispers, compelling and hypnotic. Do not let this sinner cloud your judgment with his lies. I have seen the signs with my own eyes. The girl must burn, and anyone who protects her shares in her corruption. Sheriff Bronson, clearly uncomfortable but trapped by his own cowardice, cleared his throat. Thomas, I got to ask you to step aside. The town's decided, and I got to uphold the law. What law? McKenna's voice cracked like a whip. Show me the law that says a preacher's nightmares carry more weight than evidence. Show me the law that condemns a girl for gathering healing herbs for her dying grandmother. From inside the house came a sound that froze every man's blood, the voice of Mary Wilson, weak but carrying clearly through the morning air. Despite her illness, the old woman had struggled to her feet and now appeared in the doorway, supported by Sarah's trembling form. You fools, Mary wheezed, her ancient eyes scanning the faces of men she had helped bring into the world, whose wives she had delivered, whose children she had healed. You would burn a girl for doing what I taught her? For gathering the same herbs I've used to save your lives and the lives of your families for 30 years? Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mary Wilson had delivered his own children, had sat beside his wife's sickbed through a difficult birth, but Caldwell's influence was strong, and fear made cowards of good men. The old ways are Satan's ways, Caldwell declared. Medicine belongs to doctors trained in Christian institutions, not to witches trafficking with demons in the wilderness. It was then that Sarah stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the tension like a clear bell. I've done nothing but try to ease suffering. If that makes me a witch in your eyes, then your eyes are blinded by hatred, not opened by God. The simplicity and dignity of her words seemed to shake some of the men. But Caldwell sensed his hold on the mob slipping and played his final card. Seize them both, he commanded. The corruption spreads even now. Can't you see how the old woman has bewitched McKenna, turned him against his own people? Several men dismounted, their hands moving to their weapons. But McKenna raised his rifle, his voice cutting through their advance like a blade. The first man who takes another step toward my house gets a bullet between the eyes. The mob hesitated. They had expected McKenna to step aside when faced with overwhelming numbers. They hadn't counted on the steel in his spine, the unwavering resolve that had carried him through decades of frontier hardship. You can't hold us off forever, Thomas, Sheriff Bronson said, though his voice lacked conviction. There's 20 of us and one of you. McKenna's lips curved in a grim smile. Maybe so, but I guarantee you this. Some of you won't be riding home to your families tonight, and I'll make sure Caldwell is the first to fall. The preacher's face went white at the direct threat, but he recovered quickly. You see how the witch's evil has infected him. He threatens a man of God. I see a scared little man hiding behind other people's fears, McKenna replied. And I wonder what you're really so afraid of, preacher. What secrets are you trying to bury under this girl's ashes? As the standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, none of them could have imagined what was approaching through the desert silence. Miles away, a force was mobilizing that would transform this confrontation from a simple case of mob justice into something that would echo through the annals of Western legend. The sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the ranch yard where 20 armed men faced one determined rancher and 2 terrified women. But in the distance, barely visible against the morning haze, dust clouds were rising from a dozen different directions, converging on Dustbrook like streams flowing toward a mighty river. The reckoning was coming, and it would arrive with the thunder of 100 horses and the fury of women who had finally found their moment to strike back against the injustices that had plagued their frontier world for far too long. The first sound was like distant thunder rolling across the desert floor, a low, rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. Sheriff Bronson was the first to notice it, his head turning toward the horizon, where heat waves shimmered like liquid silver. His weather-beaten face creased with confusion as the sound grew louder, more distinct. What in blazes? He muttered, shading his eyes against the climbing sun. McKenna felt it too, a vibration through the soles of his boots, a tremor that spoke of something massive approaching. But his rifle never wavered from its target, still trained on Preacher Caldwell's black-clad form. Whatever was coming, he wouldn't give these men the satisfaction of seeing him distracted. Sarah Wilson pressed closer to her grandmother in the doorway, her dark eyes scanning the desert with a mixture of fear and something else, a glimmer of hope that she dared not acknowledge, even to herself. The old woman's gnarled hand found her granddaughter's shoulder, offering what comfort she could with a gentle squeeze. Then they saw them. Rising like a mirage from the shimmering desert came a sight that defied every expectation, every assumption about the nature of power in the Wild West. A line of riders stretched across the horizon, not 20 men, not 50, but 100 women on horseback, riding in perfect formation toward Dustbrook. They came from every direction, as if summoned by some invisible signal that had reached across hundreds of miles of frontier wilderness. Some rode side saddle in proper Eastern fashion, their long skirts arranged with practiced precision. Others rode astride like men, their divided skirts and leather chaps marking them as women who had long ago abandoned conventional notions of feminine propriety in favor of frontier practicality. Leading the formation was a woman who commanded attention even at a distance. Tall and straight-backed in her saddle, she rode a magnificent black stallion that seemed to dance with barely contained energy. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and even from hundreds of yards away, the authority in her bearing was unmistakable. "Jesus Christ," whispered Mayor Hutchins, his face going pale as the implications sank in. "Who are they?" But it was Sarah who answered, her young voice filled with awe and recognition. "They're the Sisterhood." The mob of men began to shift nervously in their saddles, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew under the desert sun. 20 men had seemed like overwhelming odds against one rancher and 2 women. Against 100 mounted riders, those odds had suddenly reversed in spectacular fashion. As the formation drew closer, individual faces became visible. These were women from every walk of frontier life, ranchers' wives with sun-weathered faces and calloused hands, saloon girls who had seen too much cruelty to remain silent any longer, school teachers whose quiet strength had been forged in one-room schoolhouses across the territory, Native American women whose understanding of justice went back generations, former slaves who had found freedom in the West only to watch it threatened by men like Caldwell. They were young and old, rich and poor, but they shared something that transformed them from a collection of individuals into a force of nature, the collective fury of women who had watched injustice go unpunished for too long. The leader raised her hand, and the entire formation came to a halt just outside rifle range, their horses stamping and blowing in the morning heat. The silence that followed was more intimidating than any war cry could have been. It was the silence of judgment, of reckoning, of accounts finally coming due. "Dear God," Preacher Caldwell breathed, his fanatic certainty cracking like old leather under the desert sun. "What devil's work is this?" The woman on the black stallion urged her mount forward alone, her eyes never leaving Caldwell's face. As she drew closer, her features became clear. She was perhaps 60 years old, with steel-gray eyes that had seen too much violence, too much injustice, but had never surrendered to despair. When she spoke, her voice carried across the ranch yard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Catherine Blackwood," she announced, her words cutting through the morning air like a blade. "And these women ride with me because we have heard of your intentions towards Sarah Wilson." McKenna lowered his rifle slightly, though he kept it ready. He had heard of Catherine Blackwood, a legendary figure whispered about in saloons and around campfires across the territory. Some said she had been a Union spy during the war, others that she had run the Underground Railroad through hostile territory. All agreed that she was not a woman to be trifled with. "This is none of your concern, woman," Caldwell tried to assert, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "This is a matter for the men of Dustbrook to decide." Catherine's laugh was like the sound of winter wind through canyon walls, cold, cutting, and utterly without mercy. "The men of Dustbrook," she repeated, her gaze sweeping over the mob with obvious contempt. 20 cowards who would burn a child to satisfy one man's twisted appetites. Yes, I can see how such brave men might handle this matter with wisdom and justice. Behind her, the 100 women sat their horses in perfect silence. But the threat they represented was palpable. These were not drawing-room ladies playing at rebellion. They were frontier women who had faced down hostile weather, dangerous wildlife, and violent men. They had buried children, defended their homes, and carved civilization from wilderness with their bare hands. Sheriff Bronson cleared his throat nervously. "Now see here, ma'am, this is official business. You got no right to interfere with the law." "The law?" Catherine's voice dripped with disdain. "Show me the warrant, Sheriff. Show me the evidence. Show me anything beyond the fevered imaginings of a man whose reputation for preying on young women is known from Denver to San Francisco." Preacher Caldwell's face went white as bone. "You dare?" "I dare many things," Catherine cut him off. "I dare to ask why 3 girls have left Dustbrook in the past 2 years, rather than submit to your spiritual counseling. I dare to wonder why you're so eager to see Sarah Wilson burn when her only crime is refusing your advances." A collective gasp rose from the mob. Several men turned to stare at Caldwell, pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place. The preacher's face was a mask of rage and fear, but he could find no words to deny the accusation. Mayor Hutchins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Catherine, even if what you say is true, you can't just ride in here with an army and—" "An army?" Catherine smiled, and there was something terrifying in that expression. "This isn't an army, Mayor. This is a reckoning, and it's been a long time coming." She raised her hand, and from the formation behind her came a sound that chilled the blood of every man present, the whisper of 100 rifles being drawn and cocked, the metallic chorus of women who had finally decided that enough was enough. The standoff had become something far greater than a dispute over one girl's fate. It had become a moment when the balance of power in the frontier was about to shift, when women who had endured decades of injustice in silence had found their collective voice and the strength to use it. In the distance, thunderclouds were building on the horizon, as if nature itself was preparing to witness what was about to unfold in the dusty yard of Thomas McKenna's ranch. The silence stretched between the two forces like a wire drawn tight enough to snap. 100 women with rifles trained on 20 men who had thought themselves the masters of justice. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the ranch yard where the future of Dustbrook and perhaps the entire territory hung in the balance. Catherine Blackwood's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Preacher Caldwell, you have a choice to make. You can confess your crimes against the young women of Dustbrook, or we can ride into town and let the people hear testimony from the 3 girls you drove away." Caldwell's black eyes darted frantically between the 100 rifles pointed in his direction and the faces of the men who had followed him here. He could see doubt creeping into their expressions, the terrible realization that they had been manipulated by a man whose righteousness was nothing but a mask for his predatory nature. "This is preposterous," he sputtered, but his voice cracked with fear. "You would take the word of fallen women over a man of God? Fallen women?" The voice came from within the formation of riders, a young woman with auburn hair and eyes that blazed with righteous fury. She urged her horse forward, joining Catherine at the front of the formation. "Is that what you called me when I was 15, preacher? When you cornered me in the church after evening service and told me it was God's will that I submit to your desires?" McKenna watched as recognition dawned on several faces in the mob. This was Rebecca Morrison, Pete Morrison's daughter, who had supposedly left town to marry a rancher in Colorado 2 years ago. But looking at her now, at the pain and anger etched in her young features, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Another rider emerged from the formation, this one a girl who couldn't have been more than 17. "And what about me, preacher? Was it God's will when you tried to force yourself on me in the rectory? When you told me that if I spoke of it, you'd have me branded as a witch?" Preacher Caldwell's face had gone from white to gray, the color of old bones bleached by desert sun. Around him, his supporters were beginning to edge their horses away, the horrible truth of what they had been party to finally sinking in. But it was the third voice that broke him completely. From the back of the formation came an older woman, her silver hair braided with ribbons in the Native American style. When she spoke, her accented English carried the weight of ancient wisdom and infinite sadness. "My daughter was 14 when you took her innocence, false holy man. She could not bear the shame and walked into the desert one night, never to return. For 2 years I have prayed to the spirits of my ancestors for justice. Today, they have answered." The effect on the mob was immediate and devastating. These weren't mysterious strangers making wild accusations. These were daughters, sisters, mothers from their own community. The web of lies that Caldwell had woven around himself unraveled completely in the harsh light of truth. Sheriff Bronson was the first to break. His gun belt hit the dust with a metallic thud as he raised his hands in surrender. I didn't know," he stammered. "God help me. I didn't know." Mayor Hutchins followed suit, his face buried in his hands as the magnitude of what they had almost done sank in. One by one, the men of the mob threw down their weapons, their earlier bloodlust transformed into shame and horror. But Preacher Caldwell, cornered and desperate, made one final play. His hand darted toward the pistol at his belt, his twisted mind perhaps believing he could still salvage his position through violence. He never cleared leather. The report of Catherine Blackwood's rifle echoed across the desert like the crack of divine judgment. Caldwell toppled from his horse, clutching his shattered shoulder, his weapon spinning away into the dust. The would-be witch-burner lay writhing in the dirt, brought low by the very people he had sought to oppress. "He'll live," Catherine announced matter-of-factly, lowering her smoking rifle. "Long enough to stand trial for his crimes anyway." Thomas McKenna finally allowed himself to lower his weapon completely. The danger was past, but he found himself staring in awe at the sight before him. 100 women who had ridden from across the territory to protect one innocent girl. It was something out of legend, a tale that would be told around campfires for generations to come. Sarah Wilson stepped forward from the doorway, her young face streaked with tears of relief and gratitude. "How did you know?" she asked Catherine. "How did you know to come?" Catherine's stern features softened as she looked down at the girl. "Your grandmother sent word, child. The night before you were accused, she managed to get a message to an old friend. Mary Wilson and I rode together with the Underground Railroad during the war. She knew that if evil came for you, the sisterhood would answer." Behind Catherine, the formation of women began to disperse, some heading back to their homes across the territory, others riding toward Dustbrook to ensure that justice would be properly served. But they had made their point clear. The days when women could be victimized with impunity in the frontier were ending. Mayor Hutchins approached McKenna with hat in hand, shame written across his florid features. "Thomas, we owe you an apology that can never be sufficient, and we owe our lives to these remarkable women." McKenna nodded grimly. "You owe more than apologies, Hutchins. You owe this community a promise that something like this will never happen again." As the sun reached its zenith, casting everything in harsh, revealing light, the people of Dustbrook began the long process of coming to terms with how close they had come to committing an unforgivable act. Preacher Caldwell was loaded into a wagon, bound for the territorial capital where he would face trial for his crimes. Sheriff Bronson resigned his badge on the spot, unable to live with the knowledge of how badly he had failed his oath. But it was the sight of Sarah Wilson, walking arm in arm with her grandmother toward Catherine Blackwood's horse, that provided the true redemption of the day. The girl who had been condemned as a witch was revealed for what she truly was: a healer, a caretaker, a young woman whose only crime had been her vulnerability in a world that preyed upon the weak. Catherine leaned down from her saddle to clasp Sarah's hand. "You have sisters now, child, across this territory and beyond. Women who will stand with you, protect you, and ensure that your voice is heard. The West is changing, and women like you are leading that change." As the legendary Catherine Blackwood and her riders disappeared into the shimmering heat waves of the desert, Thomas McKenna stood in his ranch yard and contemplated the events of the day. He had expected to make a simple stand for justice and decency. Instead, he had witnessed the birth of something far greater, a network of women who refused to remain silent in the face of injustice, who would ride any distance and face any danger to protect the innocent. The Wild West would never be the same. And in the quiet moments that followed, as Sarah Wilson tended to her grandmother and the people of Dustbrook began the hard work of rebuilding their community on a foundation of truth rather than fear, it was clear that the change would be for the better. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up for what's right, and sometimes that stand awakens a force powerful enough to transform the world.